Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game. And today I'm going to be talking about my TGT Budget Warlock deck. This is a deck designed for brand new players to the game, people who have not had time to get a big collection or open a lot of packs and don't have much dust to work with and don't have a very big card collection to work with. So this deck has a dust limit of 600 arcane dust, meaning it's very, very affordable. It's just about as affordable as you can get while still having a semi-competitive deck. So if you're not brand new to the game, this is not the deck for you. You should probably stop watching now and look for another guide. But if you are a fresh player who's still really struggling to find the right cards and a deck that works for you, and you want to play Warlock, this is the kind of deck that could be perfect for you. It includes a lot of free basic cards and only a handful of common quality cards as well, so those only cost 40 dust apiece. You can start putting this deck together really, really quickly. It should only take 10 or 15 packs worth of dust to get all these cards. Now this deck admittedly won't carry you all the way to legend rank. It's not going to be that good. You will hit a limit where other people have better cards and better decks, but it can get you past rank 20, and it may even take you as high as somewhere around rank 15, rank 12 if you're very skilled and patient and learn to play this deck. And, maybe rank 10 if you're very, very gifted. This deck does have potential to move you up the ladder if you learn it and play it well. So it's a great opportunity for new players. The general strategy of this deck is basically what is called a zoo deck. It's called a zoo because it just basically puts a lot of different things out onto the board, a lot of different animals or beasts, if you will, much like a zoo. I don't really know why it's called zoo specifically, but that is the deck that Zoo Warlock, that's the name that has been adopted by the community, so I'm sticking with it. It's really just more about board presence in particular, and it's an aggressive deck. So it's a TGT budget Aggro Warlock. The goal of the deck is not necessarily to rush down the enemy's health total with using charge minions or damage. It's really more about building a stable and solid board out of sticky minions and then capitalizing on that board with buffs and damage abilities based on minions that allow you to trade up efficiently into enemy taunts or scary enemy minions, but also put together some surprising burst damage. And because the Warlock's hero power allows you to draw cards essentially infinitely, this deck sacrifices card draw for consistent minions instead and a smooth mana curve. You'll notice our mana curve there is beautiful. So you'll have a card to play hopefully every turn, and you'll also be able to use your hero power to draw into an answer for next turn sometimes as well. So this deck can do a lot of things. It's great also for teaching new players how to play the game, just because it's all about board control and trading and doing the math and being smart and being efficient with your mana and with your cards. So not only will it help you climb the ladder, but it can also make you a better player, and I think that's pretty important for new players. So I think the best way to run through this deck is just to address every single card and give it 30 seconds to a minute worth of discussion so you understand why it's in the deck and what it does. So I'm going to start off with Mortal Coil. This is a 1-mana spell. It does 1 damage to a minion, and if it kills that minion, it allows you to draw a card. So as I mentioned before, this deck is not just about hitting the enemy face. Sometimes you're going to need to make efficient trades. If you can send a Flame Imp into something like a Piloted Shredder and kill a 4-mana card for a 1-mana card, that's going to be a good trade. So opportunities like that are something you have to look out for. Sometimes the math just won't line up, and the enemy minion that you need to get out of the way will have 1 health remaining, and Mortal Coil allows you to deal with that efficiently, kill that minion, but it also allows you to draw a card without having to use all the mana for your hero power. So there will be many cases where you only have 1 mana left. You're floating a mana at the end of the turn and you don't have a 1-drop to play. That Mortal Coil will be perfect and kind of fill your hand for next turn while still accomplishing something useful. Now do keep in mind that effect only works if the minion dies from the spell, so don't necessarily waste it just to ping a minion down, and definitely don't use it first. Always use it for that last 1 health. Up next is Power Overwhelming. This is another 1 mana spell. It gives a friendly minion +4/+4 until the end of the turn, and then that minion will die. Apparently it will die horribly, which is sad. But what this allows you to do is take something like a Flame Imp, give it +4/+4 in stats, turning it into a 7 attack minion, and then that 7 attack minion can trade up into any enemy taunt or any really scary threat that the opponent has, allowing you to use 2 mana to destroy, something like a Dr. Boom, a 7 mana card, a hyper efficient play, a 5 mana tempo gain for just 2 cards. So Power Overwhelming can be used to trade minions like that. It can also be used just for straight up damage at the end of the game. There might be a situation where the enemy has 8 health and you need to do 8 extra damage and you have 2 Power Overwhelmings and it's just enough to get the kill. So look for those opportunities as well. Next up is Soulfire, yet another 1 mana spell. This allows you to deal 4 damage, but it has the downside that when you do cast this spell, it discards a random card from your hand. Now, none of the cards in this deck are must-have cards at any given point in the game, so it's okay to discard pretty much anything. Nothing's going to cost you the game if you discard it accidentally. So the downside here is not that negative, but the upside is quite high. As a 4 damage spell, much like Power Overwhelming, it can just be an extra 4 damage to the enemy face for lethal, but you can also use it to clear minions on the other side that are really pesky or in your way. So it has a lot of flexibility like that, and it's very similar in utility to Power Overwhelming. Finally, we're going to get to some minions. Up first is Flame Imp, a 1 mana 3/2. The battlecry, deal 3 damage to your hero. Now, some new players are turned off by that battlecry. It's like, why would you want to hurt yourself? The whole point of the game is to survive, but as long as you have 1 health, you can still win the game. So using health as a resource can be pretty advantageous. Don't be scared to trade your health for other resources. Health is just like mana or anything else in that it's a resource. You don't have to have 30 to win the game. So essentially here you're trading 3 damage for 1 mana, because this should be a 2 mana card based on its stats. So you're getting that extra 2 attack out onto the board, or extra 1 attack and 1 health out onto the board a turn sooner at the cost of 3 damage. Now, you won't win many very long games with this deck. It's not designed to win super long games, so that 3 damage is pretty meaningless in the scheme of things. It's well worth it to get Flame Imp out on turn 1, because this minion, if it goes uncontested for a few turns, can do 9 damage to the enemy face, which is huge, or it can just be a real nuisance for them that they feel like they have to deal with, or can trade up efficiently into even 4 drops. So Flame Imp is very, very good and kind of a core card for this deck. Similarly, Voidwalker, another Warlock card, this time a free one, another 1 mana minion. It's a 1/3 with Taunt. Its stats don't seem that spectacular, but it's a very annoying card for enemies to deal with. For instance, if you play Flame Imp and Voidwalker together, they're going to have a harder time killing that Flame Imp when it's sitting behind the Voidwalker taunt, meaning they have to get through the Voidwalker first, preserving your more valuable higher attack minion. So if you time your Voidwalkers well, you can really disrupt the enemy's plans and save something more valuable behind it for only 1 mana. And I've won and lost games because Voidwalkers got in the way at exactly the right moment. So don't undervalue the significance of this card. Acidic Swamp Ooze. This is a 3/2 minion with a battlecry that destroys your opponent's weapon. This is really just kind of a tech card included to counter weapon classes like Warrior and Paladin in particular. If a Warrior gets a Fiery War Axe and clears up your first couple turns worth of minions, you're going to be in trouble because you do need minions to stay on the board for this deck to be successful. So sometimes Acidic Swamp Ooze will hit at the right moment and allow you to delete that enemy weapon and preserve some minions and waste their resources. So only 1 is included. It's not a super strong minion all on its own, and it's particularly weak against non-weapon classes, but having 1, sometimes it will line up in your mulligan. You can keep it against a weapon class, so it's pretty advantageous to include. Up next is a new Grand Tournament card. This is Flame Juggler, a 2 mana 2/3. It has the battlecry, deal 1 damage to a random enemy. This card is included just because it has a nice solid 2/3 body 3 health is much more than 2. It's a very significant difference. And it's a nice base for buffs like Power Overwhelming or our Dark Iron Dwarf or Shattered Sun Cleric, as we'll get to later, or even Mookless Champion. It's very efficient with those cards, but also the Battle Cry is very nice. Dealing 1 damage to a random enemy can't be overlooked. Even if it's just 1 damage to the enemy face, sometimes that can be the difference between winning the game and losing the game, but also it's very good for pinging off enemy minions. There are a lot of 1/1s in the game, so it can kill a minion all on its own or just knock them down to a health total that allows you to make an efficient trade with some other minion. So that 1 damage is pretty useful a lot of the time, and this is just a good solid 2-drop added with the Grand Tournament. Up next is Murloc Tidehunter. This is a 2-mana 2/1 that summons a second minion, a 1/1 Murloc, to its side, giving you a total of 3/2 in stats for 2 mana, which is fine. It's not the strongest card in the game, but it does give you 2 bodies for 2 mana, which is important because you want to have bodies on the board to use your Power Overwhelmings, your Dark Iron Dwarfs, your Shattered Sun Clerics. So splitting the stats into 2 bodies is more advantageous than just having 1 slightly stronger card. Plus, this is a free card, allowing us to stick to our 600 Arcane Dust limit. This is admittedly one of the weaker cards in the deck, but it still offers some value, and it's great for its cost because it's free. Up next is another card from the Grand Tournament. This is Wrathguard. This is another 2-mana card, but this time it has 4/3 in stats, which is just nuts for a 2-mana card. But there is a downside. Whenever this minion takes damage, it also deals that amount of damage to your hero, which means your face. So you have to be careful. Sometimes with this card, it can get you in trouble. If a warrior hits it with a shield slam for 20 damage, that means you're taking 20 damage to your face as well. Much like Flame Imp, you're going to be trading your own health for additional stats. It's a very similar card to Flame Imp, but 2 mana instead. It's very scary for opponents. It trades hyper efficiently, and if they don't have an answer for it by turn 3 or 4, it can rack up like 12 damage. So it's a great value body for the cost, and that's what we want is value bodies that tend to stay on the board. Up next is yet another card from the Grand Tournament. This time it's the 3-mana Argent Horse Rider. This is a 2/1 with Charge and Divine Shield. It's really nice having charge minions. Sometimes they give you that instant damage. 2 damage is not a ton, but it does add up. And the Divine Shield on this minion makes it stickier. So you can play it alongside a Dark Iron Dwarf, for instance, for 7 mana, and hit something for 4 while still staying alive, which is nice. Allows you to keep that body on the board, but also gives you instant damage for combos with like Power Overwhelming if you need a quick lethal. The next 3-mana minion is Shattered Sun Cleric. This is a basic free card. It's a 3/2 body. Has the battle cry give a friendly minion +1/+1. When we have a deck focused on loading the board up with cheap minions and keeping those minions around, being able to buff them is pretty central to it, and that's what Shattered Sun Cleric does. It's essentially 4/3 in stats for 3 mana, but 1/1 of those stats can take effect instantly if you buff something that's already on the board, kind of giving that 1/1 charge, if you will, in a sense. So this is another just high value card. It's a nice free card. It's not the best card in the whole deck, but it's pretty good. Those 1/1 in stats can allow you to trade and keep a minion alive, sneak in a little extra damage, and just make your board more resilient in general. The next card up is Wolf Rider. This is a 3/1 charge. Wolf Rider is another card that made this list simply because it's free. This deck is not always just about doing damage to the enemy face, but it is nice when you can. Wolf Rider can be a top deck that gives you lethal, can combo with a Power Overwhelming that's rotting in your hand for 7 instant damage. It's just a nice little card to throw out. Sometimes you'll throw it into enemy minions to make an efficient trade. Other times you'll send it right to the enemy face and force a response. But it can do a couple different things well, and the instant value it offers from charge is very important. Up next is Dark Iron Dwarf. This is kind of an old school Zoo Warlock staple, but it doesn't see much play anymore. But I snuck it back in because it is a very affordable card, and it's still pretty good in this deck. It's a 4/4 minion for 4 mana, and it has the battle cry, give a minion +2 attack this turn. You've heard this story before so far, but That instant to attack is pretty important. It allows you to trade up efficiently or sneak in extra damage while still depositing a very strong 4/4 body onto the board in the same turn. So as long as you're sticking minions to the board and have something to use this attack on instantly, it offers a lot of extra value. You'll be surprised how often you're happy to see Dark Iron Dwarf in your hand. Up next is another 4-mana minion. This time around it's Piloted Shredder. This is kind of the ultimate value minion in the game. It's just so very strong in so many ways, and it finds its ways into a lot of decks that you wouldn't expect it to, but it's perfect in this one. 4 mana, 4/3. It has a Death Rattle effect that summons a random 2-cost minion. So that strong 4/3 body is good on its own, but anytime they kill it, they still have to deal with a second minion, which is perfect. Sometimes those 2-cost minions are very good. They can be as good as a 4/4 body. Other times they won't be so great. But for this deck, it's really just more important that there's any kind of minion on the board. So it's very hard to miss with this card. The 4 damage is high. They can't ignore it because it adds up way too quickly. If they do, if they kill it, you're still getting a nice little bonus to use with your buff cards. So Piloted Shredder is potentially the best card in this deck. At 5 mana, we have the Frostwolf Warlord. It's only a 4/4 at its basic level, but has the battle cry that gives it 1/1/1 for each other minion on the battlefield. So if you have 3 other minions on the board, this becomes a very scary 7/7. This is basically your late game threat, the kind of big bomb you can drop after you've had a few good turns and there's still some minions on the board. You can turn this into a very difficult minion for them to deal with on turn 5. If you get a 7/7 or an 8/8 out on turn 5, and they don't have an answer, you're almost certainly going to win the game. If you have that many minions on the board alongside it, it means you're already in a great spot. So there will be times this card comes up empty. It's not a good comeback card. If you don't have minions on the board, it's going to be very hard for this to get value because it might just come out as a 4/4 or 5/5, and that's not a great play. But it can seal games that are near escape. So if you're winning and you want to make sure you still win, Frostwolf Warlord can be the game-securing card that you drop. The big bomb that finishes them off, if you will. And then finally, one more Grand Tournament card snuck its way onto this list. It's Mookless Champion. This 5 mana 4/3 has an Inspire effect that gives your other minions +1/+1. You can see why that's beneficial with our deck that's designed to keep minions on the board. This time it just buffs your board and reinforces what you've already have. It's kind of similar to Frostwolf Warlord, but it disperses the stats across multiple minions instead of stacking it all into one big scary threat, which can be better. Unfortunately, it is a little bit more expensive since Frostwolf Warlord's free, and we can only sneak one into this list because you can't afford to have too many high-cost cards in this list or your curve will be thrown off. And we don't want that. So only one Mookless Champion, but it's a great late-game answer. Turn 7, it can do some crazy stuff, and if they don't have an answer for it immediately, it will win games all on its own. So there you have it. That is the 30 cards in the TGT Budget Warlock. I know that for me it's useful to hear a mulligan guide. So what cards do you want to keep in the mulligan? So I'm going to run through that real quickly. It's actually quite simple. You never want to keep anything that's 3 mana or more. So any of these cards that are 3 or higher, always toss those back in the mulligan. X those guys out. You never want to keep your 1 mana spells. None of these are good in your opening hand. You might think, oh, they're 1 mana, they're cheap, I'll keep them so I have something to play. Don't. They're not good. Mortal Coil is okay at the very best. Power Overwhelming and Soulfire are both cards you want to see later in the game because they're not useful on turn 1. You don't want to Soulfire the enemy face on turn 1. That's just a waste of 4 damage. You can save it later for a lethal push or a very high value minion clear. You want to get that value later on. You don't want to empty your hand and waste 4 damage. So any of your 1 mana spells, throw them out. Get rid of those in the mulligan. Anything 3 or more. And then what you want to keep are your 2 mana minions and your 1 mana minions. Flame Imp and Voidwalker are your highest priorities. They're both fantastic to have in the mulligan. If you can get a 1-drop out on time, it's huge. Against weapon classes, I would always keep Acidic Swamp Ooze in the mulligan. You're going to pretty much guarantee that value against any weapon class, so keep it in the mulligan. And if you don't have a 1-drop, you should keep all your 2-drops. Flame Juggler, Murloc Titanhunter, Wrathguard. They're all fine to have in the mulligan. You want to make sure you have that 2-drop. If you don't have a 1-drop or a 2-drop to start the game, you're done for. You have no chance to win. So keep those 2-drops, look for 1-drops, and throw all those 3s, 4s, 5s away. Throw those 1-mana spells away. So, you know the strategy, you know the cards, you know the mulligans. One last thing I think is helpful if I'm a new player is I want to know how to make this deck better. As I said, this deck is not perfect. It uses a lot of free cards. It can be upgraded in a couple different ways. As you start to play it, you'll identify those upgrades yourself. But I have a few specific recommendations that I want to make for this deck. So, up first, one card that's fantastic in this deck, super wonderful, absolutely fantastic zoo card, is Imp Gang Boss. This is a 2/4 3-mana card. Anytime it takes any kind of damage, it summons an extra 1/1 Imp. So, potentially it can take 4 points of damage, right? If the enemy is very bad at clearing it, or you get to make really neat trades, it can take 4 damage. That means it can summon 4 additional 1/1 Imps. That means you could theoretically get 6-8 in value of stats from a 3-mana card. It's really hard for opponents to deal with. They feel extra threatened by it. It's just a really high value play on turn 3. It helps you load up the board for all these buffs. Imp Gang Boss is perfect. The problem is, even though it's a common card, it's only accessible through the Blackrock Mountain Adventure, and it can be very expensive to either purchase the Blackrock Mountain Adventure with cash or to unlock it with gold. So I don't think a Blackrock card is particularly favorable to a budget deck. I feel unfair including this. But if you do have a chance, if you like this deck, you're enjoying it, you have a chance to unlock that wing of Blackrock Mountain that unlocks Imp Gang Boss, it could be a really strong addition to this deck. It's also just a great Warlock card in general that's used in a wide variety of decks, so you'll get long-term value out of this as well. And I always recommend that players do unlock the adventures. It's a guaranteed way to get generally strong cards and build out your collection. You know what you're going to get, so there are no surprises, and you can really guarantee the dust and gold efficiency that way. Another recommendation I have is a second Warlock card. This time around it's an old one though. It's the 5-mana Doom Guard. It's a scary 5/7 with charge, which is insane value for 5 mana. It does have the downside Battlecry discard 2 random cards. So you're trading all the value in the stats and the charge effect for 2 random cards from your hand. The thing about this deck is usually by turn 5 or 6, you won't have a very large hand. You're going to be spending multiple cards per turn. Like turn 4, you might play 2 2-drops, or turn 5, a 3-drop and a 2-drop. So your hand will typically be mostly empty by turn 5, meaning Doom Guard is only going to possibly discard 1 or 2 cards, but they're the cards that are left over or undervalued. So it's usually not a big downside when it discards those 2 random cards. But the upside on a huge body like this that does 5 instant damage is just great. You can kill a 3/5 taunt like a Sludge Belcher instantly and still have a very scary minion left behind. Even if you play it on an empty board or run it into the enemy face, they have to find a way to deal with it, and it's very difficult to do 7 damage like this. And it's very hard to remove this because it's not susceptible to something like a big Game Hunter, for instance. So this is great to play on curve. It's great to top deck in the late game to find a surprise lethal. It's just a really strong card in general, and it's the perfect late game answer. You can take out your Frostwolf Warlords and sneak in a pair of Doom Guards instead. Oh, in regards to the Imp Gang Boss, you should remove your 2 Wolf Riders and put in the Imp Gang Boss instead. Trade in that charge for that value. I have one other recommendation I want to make. That is the 2-mana Knife Juggler. This is a 3/2 minion. After you summon a minion, it deals 1 damage to a random enemy. So this guy will just start throwing knives like crazy anytime you play a minion. And we do have a lot of cheap minions, so it's not hard to play a Knife Juggler and 2 or 3 minions right alongside it that allow you to do 3 damage to the enemy side of the board. This is essentially your Flame Juggler, but it's the Flame Juggler on steroids. It's a Flame Juggler that has a much higher potential and the 3 damage body is also scarier for opponents if they don't answer it. So it's a great card to add to this deck. It works even better with something like Imp Gang Boss. So I would recommend a Knife Juggler. It's a staple in almost every aggressive deck these days. It's an old card, but it's still so good. If you do have the spare 100 dust to craft this thing, you're going to be using it a lot in this deck, and you'll still use it in future decks as well. So Knife Juggler is a great addition. Now there are multiple more cards you can replace in this deck. You should look for replacements for basically all of the free cards. Anything that doesn't have the common level gem on it in this deck is replaceable. You'll discover upgrades and things that you think fit, and I encourage you to try those out and experiment and refine this deck list. But even as it stands, it's still very strong, and like I said, you should be able to play this deck to rank 15, possibly even rank 12 if you have a lot of patience and skill. So I hope you enjoyed the TGT Budget Warlock. I think it's pretty fun to play. It's great at learning the game, and it still has a lot of power to get you some wins. So good luck out there with the TGT Budget Warlock. Thanks so much for watching. I do appreciate all your time. And until next time, game on.